Hey everybody, hey now. Well, last week I talked extensively about Tetris, so I guess it's time to once again talk about something obscure, weird, and very Japanese. But before I get to that, I have to append one of my previous episodes. In an earlier episode of the season, I went over the history of the Ys series. That was a very well-received episode of Clearing Confusion, with a lot of people praising the amount of research that went into it, and for that I'm very grateful. But can you believe I left a game out? Yeah, it's one of those super obscure spin-off games that only came out in Japan. I wasn't even aware of its existence. And on pages like Wikipedia, it isn't mentioned as part of the Ys series at all. I only came around to its existence recently, and check this out, it's a fighting game. The title is Ys vs. Sora no Kiseki Alternative Saga. It features characters from Ys and characters from Trails in the Sky. Trails in the Sky is part of another series from Nihon Falcom, and I'll be talking about that today. But before I get to that, I want to mention the Ys crossover game. I'll have more info on it a bit later. Anyway, let's talk about Dragon Slayer. When you think of very early action RPGs, there's, of course, Zelda. That's usually one of the more popular ones to mention. But before Zelda, there was Ys. Before Ys, there was Hydlide. But before that, there was Dragon Slayer. Dragon Slayer from Nihon Falcom is one of the most innovative games that doesn't seem like much today, but back then was a big deal. Now, there were dungeon crawler games that seemed to facilitate action-based battles, but actually used a turn-based system. One seminal example of this was Rogue, and its many copiers, which are affectionately called roguelikes, much like the way that first-person shooters were once called Doom clones. But Dragon Slayer was the first RPG to actually use real-time action-oriented combat. Its use of puzzles using in-game items was also a huge influence on later games like Zelda. Dragon Slayer has received so far 7 sequels, though many of them are not called Dragon Slayer, or have completely different names and styles of gameplay, and there's no ongoing narrative to the series, as they are different in story and setting as they are in gameplay. The reason it's considered one series is that Dragon Slayer is not so much a traditional series of games, but rather the work of one man, Yoshio Kiya, who produced all the games. However, a series of 8 games is not all that confusing, especially considering that they're not related to each other, and that there's no timeline or anything like that. Well, if that were the case, the only thing I would have to do would be to tell you which games are in the series and what order they came out with, and that's it, I'd be done. But it's not quite that simple. Some of the games, particularly Dragon Slayer 5 and 6, have their own sequels and have branched off into separate series, some going on well past the Dragon Slayer series, and one still has more games coming out. Even the Wikipedia page for the Dragon Slayer series only lists 17 games, when in reality there's quite a lot more. Oh, and by the way, you probably might not have heard of this series, at least not most of you, but if you're around my age and you had an NES and you liked fantasy games, there's a good chance that you did play 1 or 2 of them. So anyway, let's talk about the series. I already told you about the original game. It was originally developed by Nihon Falcom for their typical array of Japanese PCs. Not as many as the Ys games, but it was released for the PC 8801, the PC 9801, and the Super Cassette Vision, which was a weird Pong-type console that used cartridges. It was made by Epoch. Square published a version of Dragon Slayer for the MSX. It also later showed up on the Game Boy, developed and published by Epoch. That's right, the ones who made the Super Cassette Vision. The last version showed up on the Saturn as part of a collection, and if you watched the episode about Ys, you know the one I'm talking about, Falcom Classics Volume 1, which has Ys, Dragon Slayer, and Xanadu on it. These are pretty obscure, but it gets better. There was a sequel to Dragon Slayer, but I'm not talking about Dragon Slayer 2. Actually, I'm talking about an unofficial sequel made by Epoch for the Game Boy. This one's called Dragon Slayer Gaiden. Once again, it's so obscure, it's not even mentioned on Wikipedia. Unfortunately, none of the versions of Dragon Slayer or its unofficial sequel Dragon Slayer Gaiden ever came to America. They're all Japan only. I've heard rumors of a fan-translated version of the Game Boy version, but I haven't seen it. So let's move on to the second game. The second game is Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, sometimes referred to as only Xanadu. This one's very different as it adopts a side-scrolling view, kind of like Ys 3 or Zelda 2. But it only uses the side-scrolling view for exploration. When you go into battle, it goes to an overhead view. That's sort of the opposite of Zelda 2, where the overworld was an overhead view and the battles were side-scrolling. Xanadu came out for some of the same systems, though there's some differences. It originally came out for the PC 8801 and then the PC 9801, the MSX, the MSX2, the FM2, and the X1. As I mentioned previously, it was also a part of Falcom Classics Volume 1 along with the original Dragon Slayer and Ys. The Saturn version of it was also showed up on Windows by itself. This time, all of the ports were developed and published by Nihon Falcom. However, it's not time to move on to the third game, not by a long shot, as Xanadu got several sequels of its own, becoming its own series in a sense. First came a direct sequel, Xanadu Scenario 2, although it's only sort of a sequel as it acts more like an expansion pack. Well, let me explain. It's a sequel in the sense that it continues the story past the original, but it's an expansion pack in the sense that it requires the original game to play. Basically, you'd make your character on a custom Xanadu Scenario 2 disc, but then you'd have to switch the disc to the original Xanadu until it prompted you to put the Xanadu Scenario 2 disc back in. Seems like a lot of hassle by today's standards, but that was pretty normal back in the day. Scenario 2 is considered also to be really good, way beyond what a typical expansion pack would be. Xanadu and its expansion pack have never been released in English. Next, Nihon Falcom licensed the Xanadu trademark to Hudson Soft, who created the NES game Phazanadu. Yes, that's how you pronounce it. You might be familiar with this one. But contrary to popular belief, Phazanadu is not a port of Xanadu, nor is it a remake or really connected to the game at all, but rather Hudson Soft used the name and created their own game. Though it shared some things in common with Xanadu, it was a totally new game. The Fa in Phazanadu comes from Famicom, as if to say, Famicom Xanadu. This game uses a side-scrolling perspective for all aspects of the game, similar to Ys 3. As you probably know, Phazanadu was brought to America on the NES. Next came Revival Xanadu for the PC 9801. This one is sort of an enhanced port of the original game, with new higher resolution graphics and new music. The expansion was also revived as Revival Xanadu 2 Remix, also for the PC 9801, which did pretty much the same thing except that it included new maps. The next two can get kind of confusing. There was another Revival Xanadu, which was not done by Nihon Falcom, but instead by Memorial Games. This one came out for Windows. This one is pretty much considered to be a butchered port. If you want a better port, there's also Xanadu Complete Reprint Edition, also for Windows, which lovingly recreates the original game. The only difference is the medium is CD-ROM as opposed to floppy disks. Lastly, there's Xanadu Next. This one came out years later, in 2005, and featured a much darker tone than the old Xanadu games. Xanadu Next was published by Nokia, who made it for Windows, and also the dreaded electric taco itself, the N-Gage. There is one more game with Xanadu in the title, but it's considered part of the Dragon Slayer series, and it comes along much later, so we'll come back to that. So let's move on to Dragon Slayer 3, or Dragon Slayer Jr. Yeah, I guess kind of like how the sequel to Donkey Kong was Donkey Kong Jr., there's his Dragon Slayer Jr. The full title is Dragon Slayer Jr. Romancia, and it's usually referred to as just Romancia, but trust me, this is the third game in the series. Unlike some games that would slap the suffix Jr. on the title, it's not easier or more for kids, though it does have a slightly more cartoonish look to the artwork and in some ways is streamlined. There's no more character customization, and the numbers usually associated with stats such as hit points and magic are simplified as hearts and other icons. The game is short, but that's not to say that it's easy. There's actually a time limit to it. You have to beat it within a half hour, and it must be done in one sitting. There's no save feature. This almost makes it more of an adventure game than an RPG, but hey, whatever. Romancia is also a bit like Phazanadu in the way that you're always in a side-scrolling mode, no matter what. The game was developed and published by Nihon Falcom for the PC 8801 and later wound up on the PC 9801, the MSX, and the MSX2. A better version came out for the Famicom with tighter controls and no time limit. The Famicom version was developed by Compile and published by Tokyo Soseki. An enhanced version of the game was made by Unbalance for Windows. This one is called Romancia: Another Legend. Although this version had better graphics, it was considered to be a pretty underwhelming port, though it did have a save feature and it came with an art book, and you could play the original PC 8801 version on it. None of the versions of Romancia have ever been released in America. The fourth game in the series is called Dragon Slayer 4 Drazzle Family, in which you take control of one of 5 characters from a family, oddly enough not named the Drazzle family, they're named something else. Drazzle is a shortened version of Dragon Slayer. Anyway, each have their own abilities. The object of the game is to find 4 crowns, which you use to find a sword to kill a dragon. You'll have to use every member of the family, as they each have abilities and can use different items. It's one of those go-anywhere exploration type of games made popular by Metroid and later Castlevania games, only with the addition of having to figure out which characters can go through which areas. The game was also the first in the series to not have a PC 8801 version. Actually, there's only 3 versions of the game: the MSX, MSX2, and Famicom. The MSX and MSX2 versions are developed and published by Nihon Falcom. The Famicom version, which changed the title to The Legacy of the Wizard, was developed by Quintent and published by Namcot in Japan and Broderbund in America, making it the first game in the series to get an official release in America. Remember, Fazanadu was not a port of Xanadu. All of the versions are pretty much the same. They're always side-scrolling, and all that's different is the graphics, really, with the MSX2 and the NES versions being almost the same, and the original MSX one being slightly worse off. The next game is kinda all over the place. It doesn't have the words Dragon Slayer in the title at all, but is rather called Sorcerian, and once again, it led to its own string of sequels, and this one gets confusing. Sorcerian continues the same idea as the previous games, all side-scrolling, but it returns to the more complicated system found in Xanadu rather than the stripped-down Romancia or the more action-oriented Legacy of the Wizard. Some people refer to Sorcerian as a Japanese Western RPG, a Western-style game, but made in Japan. I guess the opposite of that would be Chronicles of a Dark Lord, a Japanese-style game made in America. Shameless plug is shameless. Man, there are a lot of versions of this. It originally came out for the PC 8801, even though the last game didn't. I guess people complained. It was also ported to the PC 9801, the PC 88VA, the Sharp X1 Turbo, and the MSX2, and later on a DOS version that actually came out in America. There was a large number of add-ons for the game. It actually gets a bit ridiculous, and there are multiple developers for them. Nihon Falcom developed the Sorcerian Utility Volume 1, not to be confused with the next one, the Sorcerian Additional Scenario Volume 1. Then there was the Sorcerian Additional Scenario Volume 2, Sengoku Sorcerian, and finally Sorcerian Additional Scenario Volume 3, Pyramid Sorcerian. So basically they developed 4 add-ons. 3 of them, the ones called additional scenarios, were like typical add-ons. In other words, sequels to the game that continued the story but required the original disc. And the one called Utility Volume 1 enhanced the original game, allowing you to do more things in it. I guess they were probably planning on releasing more utility discs as it was called Volume 1, but they never happened. In addition to these, more new scenarios came out that were developed by Amorphous. The first one was called Sorcerian New Scenario Volume 1, The Visitor from Outer Space. Once again, it was called Volume 1, but there was no Volume 2. Instead, after this, they released Selected Sorcerian 1, Selected Sorcerian 2, and so on until Selected Sorcerian 5. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was one more add-on, this one developed by Quasarsoft, and this one was called Gilgamesh Sorcerian. Of course, it's confusing where they were actually released. The utility disc was only for the PC 8801. The official scenario discs from Nihon Falcom were released for the PC 8801 and the PC 9801, and you can get Volume 2 and 3 together for the MSX2, but not the first one. Visitor from Space was released from the PC 8801 and PC 9801, as was Gilgamesh Sorcerian. Believe it or not, the selected Sorcerian discs were actually made by fans. Well, sort of. They're still official. They were contest winners who submitted ideas for new scenarios, and Falcom made the best ones. I unfortunately don't know what systems these discs were available for. The MSX2 fans missed out on most of this, only getting the add-on disc that contains Sorcerian Additional Scenario Volumes 2 and 3, though the MSX2 one is interesting as being the only one to be named Dragon Slayer 5. Other than the DOS version, these were all only in Japan. But no, there's more. Later on, Sorcerian came out for the Mega Drive, the international name for the Sega Genesis. This version is considered one of the best, though unfortunately it stayed in Japan, though you can get a fan-translated version for emulation. The next console version was for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM, what we would call the Turbo Duo. This one's a lot like the Mega Drive one, but even more improved, but unfortunately it was only released in Japan. After that, it seemed like they were finally done, but Sorcerian just keeps coming back. It next showed up on Windows as Sorcerian Forever, but this is not an enhanced port, but an entirely new Sorcerian game. In other words, a sequel with entirely new scenarios and gameplay improvements. But of course that's not confusing enough, so they did do an enhanced version of the original Sorcerian for Windows, though at least they gave it an easy-to-understand title, Sorcerian Original. Both of these stayed in Japan. These versions were published by a company called Victor, who next made another sequel, this one called Sorcerian Disciples of Seven-Star Sorcery. Say that 10 times fast. This one is a Japan exclusive and is also exclusive to the Dreamcast. This one featured a more modern graphic look, though some people complained it looked more like a PlayStation game. It retained the 2D side-scrolling view, though in this case it's more like 2.5D. One last thing, just to make it insane, there's one more Sorcerian game, and this one is an MMO. Yeah. It's appropriately called Sorcerian Online. It's for Windows only, and only for those of you in Japan. So right, Dragon Slayer. We were up to 5. Let's talk about 6. And yeah, this is another insane one, which became its own series. The series is known as the Legend of Heroes series, and it's broken into 3 parts. The first part is part of the Dragon Slayer series. The second part is called the Gogharv trilogy, and is not part of the Dragon Slayer series. And the current series is the Trails series. So basically, Dragon Slayer 6 became its own series, but only the first 2 are considered part of the Dragon Slayer series, though the first sequel is not Dragon Slayer 7. Wow. So, the first one, which is Legend of Heroes 1, but is also Dragon Slayer 6, is called Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes. It was originally released for, you guessed it, the PC 8801, then it showed up on the PC 9801, the FM7, the MSX2, the Sharp X68000, and Windows. Those are all the PC versions, all of which stayed in Japan. For consoles, it came out for the Mega Drive, the Super Famicom, and the TurboGrafx-16. The Super Famicom version is especially interesting as it used the Saddle-of-You add-on. Out of these, the only one to come out in America was the TurboGrafx-16 one. The Mega Drive one came out for the Virtual Console, but as that one was already Japan exclusive, it hasn't been on the American Virtual Console, and it likely won't be unless they use the TurboGrafx version. The game was also remade along with its direct sequel and put on a collection which appeared on both the PlayStation and the Saturn, only in Japan. So basically, if you want to play that one, you need a TurboGrafx. The direct sequel is called Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes 2, which, despite being a sequel to a Dragon Slayer game, is not part of the Dragon Slayer series, but it is the second game in the Legend of Heroes series. This one faced pretty much the same deal. It was released for less systems, though. It came out for the PC 8801, PC 9801, Mega Drive, Super Famicom, PC Engine, DOS, and even the FM Towns, as well as being a part of the collection for Saturn and PlayStation. The Mega Drive version is on the Wii Virtual Console. There's currently no way to play this one in English. Next is the Gogharv trilogy, and no, it doesn't get less confusing. The first one in this series is called The Legend of Heroes 2, Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch. That's right, it's part 2, even though there was already a Part 2. But I can explain this. In Japan, it's actually called The Legend of Heroes 3 White Witch. This makes sense as it's the third game in that series. This version was released for the PC 9801, the Saturn, the PlayStation, Windows, and the PSP. All of those stayed in Japan except for the PSP version, which actually got an American release. But if you remember, the other Part 2 had not come out in America, so I guess calling it Part 3 would confuse people. So they renamed it The Legend of Heroes 2 Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch. Personally, I think they should have dropped the numbers totally and just called it Legend of Heroes Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch. Saying that people would get confused if you call it 3 assumes that people getting it for PSP were aware of Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes for TurboGrafx 16, which seems unlikely to me, so it's likely that the 2 is just as confusing. Most people probably wondered what it was a sequel to, or even worse, they didn't buy it at all because it was a sequel and they never had played the original. Well, it looks like they pretty much took my advice with the next game, but it didn't help matters. Actually, it made it a lot worse. This game, in Japan, has a very sensible name, if not a tiny bit rough to translate. It comes off as The Legend of Heroes 4 Red Tear. This is fine. It's the fourth game in the Legend of Heroes series, so it's called Part 4, and it has a subtitle. It was made for the PC 9801, the PlayStation, Windows, and the PSP. But oh man, once again the PSP version saw the light of day in America, and this time they decided to just drop the numbers altogether to avoid confusion. So it's called The Legend of Heroes A Tear of Vermilion. But what's the problem? It doesn't actually say that on the box. It actually just says The Legend of Heroes. So here's the issue. You got one game called The Legend of Heroes 2, A Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch, and another that just says The Legend of Heroes. Which is the original and which is the sequel? Well, it's the opposite of what you'd expect. And yes, it gets worse. The next game in the series, the final one in the Gogharv trilogy, in Japan has a sensible name, The Legend of Heroes 5, A Cage Song of the Ocean. It came out for only 2 systems, Windows and the PSP. The Windows version stayed in Japan, but we got the PSP one, and what was it called? The Legend of Heroes 3, Song of the Ocean. Wow. So let's break this down for a second. In America, 4 games in the series were released, 1 for the TurboGrafx 16 and 3 for the PSP. If you were to believe the titles, first came Part 1, then Part 2, then came a different Part 1, and then came Part 3. And if you only know about the PSP versions, you might go and pick up Legend of Heroes 1, 2, and 3 and play them in that order, not knowing that the actual order you're playing them in is different. If you look at the series as a whole, you're playing 4, 3, and then 5. And if you look at just the trilogy, it's 2, 1, and then 3. Nothing about this series is easy. But no, the series continues. There's another trilogy of games after this called the Trails series, and within this trilogy, the first game actually has 2 sequels. So there's basically a game with 2 sequels, but that's not the trilogy. The entirety of those 3 games makes up the first part of the trilogy, and then there's 2 more parts. What the fuck is this, Coheed and fucking Cambria? The original 3 games, which make up the first part of the Trails in the Sky trilogy, are called The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky, The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky Second Chapter, and The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky the Third. These were all released initially for Windows, and then bundled together on the PSP as The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. So at least there's that. When you get the first of the trilogy on the PSP, you're getting the entire first part. The Windows versions all stayed in Japan, but the PSP All-in-One was released in America. The second game, roughly translated as The Legend of Heroes The Miracle of Nothing, was developed directly for the PSP, and so far it's not been announced for localization, though a port of the PS Vita has been announced in Japan. Judging by how they've translated things so far, I'd guess that if it was released in America, the title would likely be The Legend of Heroes Trails of Nothingness. The third game was released earlier this year for the PSP in Japan, and so far there's no news yet on a localization. It's called The Legend of Heroes Miracle of Blue, which would probably be changed to Trails of Blue if it comes out in America. So that's the entire series of games that spawned out of Dragon Slayer 6. The first two being Dragon Slayer 6 and its direct sequel, then two trilogies of games, though the releases in America are all out of order. There's one more game to talk about, and that's a spin-off of the second trilogy, called Ys vs. Sora no Kaseki Alternative Saga. That's right, I'd mentioned that earlier. It was only for PSP and only in Japan. The roughly translated version would be Ys vs. the Miracle of the Sky, though Miracle of the Sky is called Trails in the Sky here in America. So that is a spin-off to the second game in a trilogy, the trilogy being the third part of a series, the series spawning from the sixth game in another series, and it also connects to Ys. Wow. Now, I kind of rushed through the Legend of Heroes games and didn't talk about developers or publishers, so let's go back and look at those, also offering you the opportunity to go through the entire thing in order one more time. First is Dragon Slayer The Legend of Heroes, which as you remember is the sixth Dragon Slayer game. All versions of this were developed by Nihon Falcom, and most were published by them, excepting the sole American release on Turbo Duo, which was published by Hudson Soft, the guys who made Phazanadu. Part 2, Dragon Slayer Legend of Heroes 2, all versions are developed and published by Falcom, excepting once again the PC Engine version, which was published by Hudson Soft. The third game, the first in the Gagharv trilogy, which we know as The Legend of Heroes 2 Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch, the PC, Saturn, and PlayStation versions are developed by Falcom, while the PSP one was published by Namco Bandai. The fourth game, which we know as The Legend of Heroes, Atyr and Vermilion, or as it says in the box, just The Legend of Heroes, the PC versions and PlayStation version were developed by Falcom, while the PSP version was developed by Microvision. All of the versions were published by Bandai. The fifth game, which we know as The Legend of Heroes 3, Song of the Ocean, was developed for PC by Nihon Falcom, and for PSP by Microvision. All versions were published by Namco Bandai Games. The sixth game, The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky, was developed by Nihon Falcom, who also published the PC version. The PSP version was published by Ghostlight in Japan and Xseed Games in America. Remember that the PSP version includes all three games that were collected from the original PC versions. The seventh game, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Nothingness, was both developed and published by Nihon Falcom, and the same thing goes for the eighth game, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Blue. The spin-off, Ys vs. Trails in the Sky Alternative Saga, was also developed and published by Nihon Falcom. So, that takes care of Dragon Slayer 6 and the series that it spawned. Dragon Slayer 7 also became its own little series, but it's not nearly as insane. No version of this game has ever come out in America. The game is called Lord Monarch and is drastically different from the action RPGs and side-scrollers that had come before it. This game was a war RTS, or real-time strategy game. The game was developed by Nihon Falcom, who also published it for the PC 9801 and Mega Drive. A version for the Super Famicom Satellaview add-on was published by Epoch. Rather than being straight ports, the Mega Drive and Super Famicom versions are slightly different variations on the theme set by the original PC version. The Genesis version, which had the expanded title Lord Monarch The Solid Battle Legend, is also notable as being on the Wii Virtual Console, but of course only in Japan. The Super Famicom version is also notable as being one of the very few games to use the mouse. Later on, an upgraded version of the game came out for PlayStation, this one with the full title Kingdom Recorded of a New Earth Lord Monarch. This one was developed by Nihon Falcom and published by Hamster Corporation. This version also was released for PlayStation Network, but only in Japan. Eventually a remake of the game for Windows surfaced, this time called Lord Monarch Online, with multiplayer, and it was released for free. The follow-up to the game was called Lord Monarch Pro Advanced Lord Monarch, and was released exclusively for PC. At least I think it was released. I can't find any information about the actual release date. It may not have actually come out, though I'm pretty sure it did. Although the title sounds like it's just an updated version of the first game, it's actually the follow-up. This one was published by SourceNext. The second follow-up was another really screwy and obscure PC game published by SourceNext, and this one has the infuriating name Monarch Monarch. You know how hard it is to type that into a search engine and get actual results? Oh well. So that's the series that spawned out of Dragon Slayer 7. Not as bad, but still a mess. So let's move on to Dragon Slayer 8, the final game in the series, as of yet anyway, and probably the final game overall. As the original version came out in 1994, and they've pretty much given up on Dragon Slayer. They just do the Legend of Heroes spin-off series now. Anyway, as a last bit of confusion on the Sunday, the 8th Dragon Slayer game is called Legend of Xanadu. That's right. It sounds like it's a sequel to the second game, Xanadu, but in fact it's the 8th game. Even though it has Xanadu in the title, it really doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Xanadu series. It's its own thing. Actually, the gameplay is very, very similar to the East series. It's never been released in America and was initially not on PC, making it a rare console exclusive. It came out for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM, which we would know as the Turbo Duo, and it stayed there for a long while. It eventually did make its way to PC, Windows to be exact, as part of the Falcom Special Box 2004, though there's no difference. It's literally an emulated version of the PC Engine one, so you might as well just emulate that. I'd love to end it right here, but can you believe there was a sequel? That's right, The Legend of Xanadu 2. This one was also exclusive to Japan and the Turbo Duo, or rather the PC Engine Super CD-ROM. I have no idea if it ever wound up on Windows, and as far as I know, both games were developed and published by Nihon Falcom. I can't find any contradictory info anyway. Well, that's it. Dragon Slayer may just be about the most confusing mess of a series ever. A series that each one of them has very little to do with the others. Almost every game is spun off into its own series, and one of which became a huge mess. I gotta talk about something easier next week or my brain will explode. How about next week I'll talk about those pesky ninjas in Mortal Kombat.